Hi, everyone, and welcome to my talk on human consciousness, the enigma of the mind. So, if you've been watching my talks, so far we've been kind of focused on events that happened in the Bible and potential scientific explanations for those events. But we're kind of shifting gears a little bit to talk about a topic that is partially philosophical, scientific, and religious that has kind of a lot of overlaps. And so, kind of going back into more of a scientific framework here and going to look at the human consciousness. And what can we learn about human consciousness and how does that relate to religion? So, a few thoughts on human consciousness. You may be familiar with Rene Descartes' famous saying, Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So that's kind of a common idea of how we kind of correlate the idea of the mind or the brain with kind of consciousness. Another one from a Darwinian philosopher, Michael Roos, says, why should a bunch of atoms have thinking ability? Why should I, even as I write now, be able to reflect on what I am doing? And why should you, even as you read now, be able to ponder my points, agreeing or disagreeing, with pleasure or pain, deciding to refute me or deciding that I am just not worth the effort? No one, certainly not the Darwinian as such, seems to have any answer to this. The point is that there's no scientific answer. So let's look at human consciousness and what does science have to say for it? So I wanted to start off with some foundational definitions that will kind of help you as we're moving forward in this talk. So first, what is consciousness? So consciousness can be difficult for some people to kind of define or to really grasp or wrap their head around. So consciousness is what you're aware of when you introspect, when you start to kind of look inward and think about inward. So when you pay attention to what's going on inside of you, this is consciousness. So consciousness consists of a few other things. It consists of sensations, thoughts, emotions, desires, beliefs, and free choices that make us alive and aware. So consciousness is kind of the things that are inward that we are thinking and processing and feeling. Now, the soul. So the soul or the ego, the I, or the self, and it contains our consciousness. And there's kind of two views on this with consciousness and the soul. There's the dualism view and there's the physicalist view. So the dualism view views that the soul animates our body. So it's the thing that takes our body from just being kind of this shell, and the soul is what brings it to life. And the soul is immaterial and is distinct from the body. So the dualism, you have that dualistic view. So you have kind of two parts. You have body, and then you have the soul or the consciousness. And Christianity would follow along with this dualist view. Now, the physicalist view is that the soul does not exist. Humans are solely physical beings. And one physicalist, Yegwon Kim, said, dualism of personhood is common lore, shared across most cultures and religious traditions. So it's interesting that even a physicalist who believes that the soul does not exist does recognize that this dualist perspective is seen throughout written materials, both in cultural materials, histories of different cultures, but also in religious traditions. Even though this person, Kim, does not believe in the dualist view, they recognized its kind of supremacy or how wide reaching it is throughout the globe. So, what would be the implications if physicalism is true? What would we have to kind of come from that? So, the first would be that if physicalism is true, then consciousness doesn't exist. And because remember, physicalists believe that the soul or the consciousness doesn't exist. We're just body, just material. So then consciousness doesn't exist because there would be no such thing as conscious states. that must be described from a first person point of view. So, what this means is if we don't have consciousness, then there's nothing that is a first person view. And so, what this means is everything could be described from a third person point of view. However, we know that that's really not the case. That's not the world and the environment that we live in. We know that first person subjective points of view exist. We can say, I feel this or I perceive this. And you, as a third person, can't really say what, the other person's like perceives, like you perceive this. You can't actually say that in a way that we would say, oh yeah, that's right. You can tell me, how I'm feeling, or you could tell me what I think on something. We wouldn't really accept that. People can try to do that, but we don't say like that is a valid way and an accurate way of being able to, describe or explain somebody. So if physicalism is true, then we would be able to do that, but we don't see that in real life. So that's kind of one thing that kind of points against physicalism. The second would be if physicalism were true, there would be no free will. That's because matter is completely governed by the laws of nature. So if we are just physical bodies and our brain is just um, determined by the laws of nature, then we can't be held accountable for kind of the things that happen. There would be no free will. So whatever is going to happen is already kind of rigged or predetermined by both my genetic makeup and the environment around me. But we all know kind of deep down inside that we're more than just a physical brain. And because of the way that we govern our world, we have laws and we have rules, we do believe that there is free will. So this second point also shows that if physicalism was true, we're not seeing that in our everyday society. Because if somebody does something, we hold them accountable. We don't just say, oh, when their brain chemistry, caused them to do that, and so it's not their fault. Third, if physicalism were to be true, there would be no disembodied intermediate state. So what that means is that we wouldn't have a separation of, your soul or your body or your consciousness from your body, that there would be no intermediate state. And so this kind of goes in relation to similar events that are described in near-death experiences. And so in near-death experiences, we see people that are talking about kind of feeling like they're outside of their bodies. So they feel like their soul or their consciousness is separate from their physical body. And so they can, perceive things, see things. There's one case of near-death experience where the person was having a surgery and they were outside of their body during that time. And they, were able to perceive that there was a shoe at the top of the hospital building. And then when they came back after the experience, returned to their body, they talked about the shoe. And they were able actually to go to the roof and realize there was a shoe at the top of the roof. So, maybe you do or do not agree with the idea of near-death experiences, but this idea of them existing adds another piece of kind of evidence or how we experience the world that is contrary to physicalism. So, if you don't agree with near-death experiences, that's okay. But you at least, for the first and second one are kind of strong evidences showing that if physicalism were true, we don't really see that played out in our everyday lives and everyday circumstances. So, so then if physicalism isn't really seen in everyday life, what about dualism? So we actually have some experimental evidence for dualism. And one of the most famous kind of evidences for this is the Wilder-Penfield experiment. And you can see him in the picture here. And so he did a lot of experiments using kind of electrical stimulus and mostly with kind of epilepsy patients and would do brain studies. So one of the experiments that he would do is he would electrically stimulate the brains of epilepsy patients. And so what he would do is he would use an electrical stimulus in the different parts of the brain that will cause them to move their arm or their leg, turn their heads or their eyes, talk, or even swallow. So he could, understanding the brain, cause these different physical motions to occur. But the patient would say like, wait, I didn't do that. You did that. So they were aware of the fact that they didn't consciously, make that motion or decide to do that. And so the patient, as this was happening, was already kind of thinking of themselves as having an existence separate from their body. So their body was doing one thing, but their consciousness and the way they were thinking and processing was differently. And so they weren't really saying, okay, it's just one combined. My consciousness and my physical brain are together. But they were seeing there was a difference. Additionally, Penfield, in his studies, saw that there was no place where electrical stimulation would cause a patient to believe or just decide. So he couldn't just like target this one place, and now they believe they really liked coffee, or one place they decided to do something or say something or move. There's no place in the brain that you can kind of stimulate and influence belief or decision making. These functions originate in the conscious self and not in the brain. So here we see a separation of kind of movements, actions, and decisions. Parts that are controlled by the brain itself, the physical aspect, and parts that are controlled in the conscious self. A few other experimental evidences for dualism. Another was by Roger Sperry and his team. They studied the differences between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And they discovered that the mind has a causal power that's independent of the brain's activities. And so this idea of that your mind can think and process and perceive things independent of kind of your brain. And there's a separation there of your consciousness and the physical part of what your brain, waves and what your brain was doing. And so what Sperry concluded was that materialism was false. So he concluded that this physicalism wasn't true, that there was an immaterial aspect to ourselves, to the brain, which was the consciousness. Another study, another electric shock study, showed that there was a delay between the time an electric shock was applied to the skin and the moment it reached the cerebral cortex. So they applied, then there was a delay before it hits the cerebral cortex, and then the self-conscious perception of it by the person. So if we were just our consciousness in our brain are one, there's no separateness, then the minute we have a physical, recognition, that should be the exact same time as the time that we perceive it. But here there's a delay. So it suggests that it's not all in one, but there is some separation. That we aren't the self, the consciousness is more than just the machine, our body, that reacts to the stimuli as it receives them. So there's this separation between our perception, our consciousness of something happening, and then the physical reaction to what is actually happening. Now, there's also some philosophical evidence for dualism. And so it is thought consciousness is not just a physical phenomenon. Okay, so it's also a philosophical phenomenon because there are things that are true of my consciousness that are not true of anything physical. Okay, so something that's true of my consciousness that's not true of anything physical, so it must be immaterial. So, for example, some thoughts have the attribute of being true and others false. So I can have a thought that, some thoughts can be true and some thoughts can be false. However, my brain state, if I were to kind of look at it on an imaging machine, however, brain states are not true or false. Brain states simply just exist. So there is something true of my conscious states that are not true of any brain states. Thus, they can't be the same thing. So this may be a little tricky to kind of understand philosophically. And so here is an example. So I could think about like so-and-so football team winning the Super Bowl, or, football meaning soccer team winning the World Cup. So I can think of these things happening. I can have these thought attributes of them being true, but that doesn't mean that they are actually true in real life. So I could think and say, okay, here's the thought I have. I have the thought that this team won the Super Bowl or this team won the World Cup. And that thought could be true or that thought could be false. But my brain state of just having the thought itself isn't true or false. Because just if you were to look at it on an imaging screen, you would just see, okay, the brain thought something. You're not going to see what the content of that thought is. That's why the brain state, it just exists. It's not necessarily true or false. But our thoughts and our consciousness can be true or false. So if one thing can be true or false and one thing can't, they can't then be the same thing. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Another thing about our consciousness is that our conscious states are inner and private. So they're not known without the person revealing them. Whereas our brain states can be studied and viewed by those outside that body, like scientists. So an example of this would be if a person is sleeping, then the scientist can see some rapid eye movement and they will be able to see that. And they can also have, somebody studying the brain and they can see, the brain is thinking through something and processing through something. So the scientist can see the brain state, can see the physical movement when someone is sleeping, but they don't know what was actually happening inside the person. So what they would have to do is they'd have to wake up the person when that's happening and say, "Hey, what's going on?" And the person would be like, "Oh, I was dreaming." When they went like, "Why'd you wake me up? I was having a dream or I was having a nightmare." But they would only know, the scientists would only know that that was happening because the person would have to reveal it. They wouldn't be able to look at it and go, "Oh, this person's dreaming. Oh, this person's having a nightmare," based on just the brain states, based on just the imaging data. What they would have to do is they would be able to, only reveal that from someone telling them. And then once they know that, then they can start trying to make some correlations and try to say, okay, these, brain imaging might correlate to, sleeping and having a dream or REM state or those kind of things. But they only can confirm that by actually asking someone when they're in those states. They can't confirm it otherwise. So yet again, there's something about the conscious state that we can know, which is different than the brain state. And so they can't be the same thing because there is this differentiation. Okay, so let's talk about the evolutionary argument. So where does consciousness come from? So maybe this will help us to kind of further look at, is it dualism? Is it physicalism? What does evolution say? So the evolutionary argument says that consciousness is just something that happens as a natural byproduct of our brain's complexity. So once evolution gave us sufficient brain capacity, consciousness inexorably emerges as a biological process. So as our brain continues to evolve and to grow, then consciousness just automatically would, of course, emerge as our brain kind of grew in capacity and ability. So that would be the evolutionary argument for that. However, this argument from evolution of where consciousness comes from has a few problems. So let's look at that. So the first problem that we have with this evolutionary argument is that this argument says that prior to this level of complexity, matter contained the potential for mind to emerge. Okay? So it's saying that within the mind, if even the more simplistic beings, that this potential for consciousness could emerge. It hadn't emerged yet, but it was there, and that it just needed to be kind of triggered and released and unlocked at the right moment. Okay. However, this is no longer considered naturalism, which is what evolution falls under, but actually is considered panpsychism. So panpsychism is the view that matter is not just inert physical stuff, but that it also contains proto-mental states in it. So not only are we now saying that everything evolved from a natural standpoint, but we're also saying that within this material, there is some sort of inert, immaterial matter that exists that's going to allow for this immaterial consciousness to emerge. And so that leads to a lot of problems. If you're trying to argue from materialism, how are you going to get this immaterial thing? And if you're saying, okay, well, the immaterial always kind of exists and it was just waiting to be released, well, where did that immaterial come from? And this also leads to another problem that if the idea that we would have a simple being and as the brain kind of grows to capacity and complexity, then now the consciousness merges and is released, then wouldn't we think that that consciousness and that brain could continue? And so wouldn't we expect then if evolution for us to have even greater beings than humans and thus a greater consciousness or a God? And so this kind of leads to the problem of the emergence of God. Why would it, be kind of in the background, waiting, waiting, waiting? Then for humans, for Homo sapiens, it's released. Now we have consciousness, and then it just doesn't keep going. So that's kind of a big problem with the evolutionary argument for consciousness. Okay, let's look at the second one. So this argument leads to determinism. So if we follow the evolutionary argument, it's going to lead to determinism. So if consciousness is just a function of the brain, so I have my brain, and because of my brain, consciousness is there, it's going to be released, then I'm my brain. And my brain functions according to the law of chemistry and physics. So this is saying my brain is functioning in a certain way, and because of that functioning, it's going to create consciousness. So what it's kind of trying to say is the mind is to the brain as smoke is to fire. So I have fire, and because there's fire, that causes smoke. Okay, so then it'd be like, oh, so because I have my brain, that's gonna cause my mind. And so it's saying that the mind is just a byproduct. So fire causes smoke, but smoke doesn't cause anything. It's just a byproduct. So by this, our mind would be determined, we would get it from our brain, but it wouldn't actually cause anything and it wouldn't really be a beneficial, factor. And what would differentiate that from everything else then? Then our consciousness would all be the same and there wouldn't be anything that our consciousness could then do. Okay, so that's the second argument, kind of, or problem with evolutionary argument for the development of consciousness. So let's look at the third problem. So this leads to an untrustworthy mind. So if we go with the evolutionary argument, then our mind would be kind of questionable. So if the mind emerged from matter without the direction of a superior intelligence, why should we trust anything from the mind as being rational or true, especially in the area of theoretical thinking? So as you're watching this video and as we're talking, we're thinking deeply. We're theoretically thinking about the development of consciousness. Where did it come from? But if my brain was just doing what it was functioned to do, following the laws of chemistry and physics, it created my mind, why would I be able to trust my mind? So an analogy of this would be, okay, so I have a computer, and this computer was, programmed by random forces or non-rational laws, but there was not a mind behind it. There wasn't something kind of organizing it. It was just creating a computer. We wouldn't trust that computer. If it spit out some information, we wouldn't just go, oh yeah, we trust it. We trust a computer because we know that it was programmed by an intelligent mind. Somebody went in and programmed the software, developed the hardware, so we feel like it's trustworthy. But we don't find, if we have an evolutionary process, then what was going behind our mind to make it trustworthy? There was no intelligent mind kind of developing the software or for the mind. Okay, our hardware, as you could say, for the brain was developed, but where was the software for the mind being developed and by who? Would we then trust it? Additionally, if our mind in all of this is developed based on just evolution, then it should all have a survival value to it. And theoretical thinking doesn't contribute to survival value, and thus not explained by evolution. So we might be able to think and process, oh, am I in danger? Am I not? Maybe, or something like that, which is more chemical. And then well, we really think through it. But theoretically thinking, oh, if I were to do this, would it lead to this or this or this? You know, that doesn't necessarily contribute to survival value because we have the fight and flight modes that are chemically wired. So, kind of theoretical thinking isn't really explained by evolution. And a British evolutionist, so evolutionist here, JBS Haldane says, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of the atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. So we use our mind to determine a lot of things, how it's even what our brains are composed of. We have used our mind, Darwin used his mind to create the evolutionary theory. But how can we trust that if it was actually developed through evolutionary processes? And so it's kind of that circular argument. How do we believe something that doesn't give us a reason to believe it based on the theory that we're trying to study? So this leads to the fourth problem with the evolutionary argument for the development of consciousness. And this is the binding problem. So if my mind, there's kind of two ways to think about this. If my mind were just a function of the brain, there would be no unified self. And this is what we mean by that. So if my mind was just related to my brain, if I were to cut my brain in half, then you'd be like, oh, you have half a brain. Like literally. Um, but you wouldn't then just say, oh, you have half a person. Like nobody would say because you have half a brain or a part of your brain is missing, that a percentage of you is now gone. So there's where this kind of binding problem is seen because we don't say the percentage of your brain that you physically have relates to the percentage of the self that you identify as. Another issue that we have, a little more scientific, is say you were to look around this room. So here's a picture of a room. When you look around this room, you see a lot of different objects. And each one of these individual objects has light waves that are bouncing off of it. And when they strike the objects, bounces off, and then they strike a different location in your eyeball. And when it does that, it sparks electrical activity in a different region of the brain. Now, there's no single part of the brain that is activated by all these things. Okay, so each part of your brain is activated by this. But there's something that binds all of these experiences and unifies them into a single conscious self. So there's no part of the brain that's like, oh, this, and this part have been activated by seeing. I need to combine them all. And we just have the different parts activated by seeing whatever we're seeing in the room. It's our conscious that actually brings it all together. And so this, yet again, suggests that consciousness and the brain are separate entities because the brain, there's no part of the brain that is determined as that binding issue. And so yet again, this is another example of that binding problem. So those are kind of the four problems that we have with the evolutionary argument. So now let's look at it a little bit deeply and see what Darwin would have said. So our Darwin evolution will never actually be able to explain the origin of consciousness. Perhaps Darwinists can explain how consciousness was shaped in a certain way over time because the behavior that consciousness caused had survival value. So maybe it can explain why the effects of consciousness were kind of favored over one, but it cannot explain the origin. So where did consciousness come? Because it cannot explain how you can get something from nothing. So remember with Darwin evolution is taking something and just modifying it to make it better. It can't explain where we have something from nothing. You have to have a starting point and modifying that starting point. So in Darwin's notebooks, he said that if there was anything his theory couldn't explain, that then there would have to be another explanation. And he said it would be a creationist explanation. So this is the suggestion that he actually posited in his notebooks. So his evolutionary theory cannot explain the origin of consciousness. It can only explain maybe how consciousness was shaped or how consciousness changed behavior, but it can't explain the origin. So it must have a creationist explanation. So what then would be able to think about from a creationist explanation? So if we were to say, okay, maybe there is a God, what would we be able to deduce about that? So say our consciousness came from a greater consciousness. So if we were to be able to be created, it would be something that was greater than us that was going to be able to create it. And so if that were the case, if our consciousness came from a greater consciousness, what would we then be able to determine about God? So if God is a greater consciousness than us, it has to be also conscious because it's creating our consciousness. So God is conscious. And since God is conscious, just like we are, then God would have thoughts, beliefs, desires, awareness, just like we have awareness of ourselves. We would act with purpose because we have free will. There are things that we do have a reason for why we do them. So God also would have free will and would act with purpose. God would be alive, just as we consider us being alive because we have consciousness. Rational, because we can do theoretical thinking, intelligent, creative, sentient, and invisible. Because remember that our consciousness is an immaterial aspect. So if God is a greater consciousness, God would also need to be invisible. So because we start with the mind of God, we don't really have a problem with explaining the origin of our mind. So the way we can think about this is if we're saying that the thing that is creating consciousness is a greater consciousness, then it doesn't seem to be such a problem of how it was able to create it. It's the same thing like nobody questions how we as mankind are able to create more mankind, because if you start with mankind, it makes sense that you can now have more mankind. So if we start with the mind of God, a greater consciousness, then we don't have a problem explaining how that God was able to create consciousness, which would be kind of a sublevel of himself. So what else can we deduce about God? So another thing that kind of helps is the idea of the soul. So in Christianity, it talks about that we have a soul. And if that were the case, then this would actually help us to understand a lot about God. So the soul helps explain omnipresence. And so omnipresence is the idea that if I'm God and I'm omnipresent, then it means that I can be everywhere. I'm present everywhere. So there's a few omnis. There's omniscient, meaning you can know all things. And omnipresence, you could be all places. You can have all power, all strength. There's a few omnis. Okay. But the soul helps us explain omnipresence. Now, the way that we can think about this is the soul occupies the body without being located in any part of it. Just like we talked about with the mind related to the soul, the consciousness, is that there's no place. You don't say, oh, my consciousness is here or here or here. It's just a part of you. And so there's no place in the body where you could say, well, here I am. Like the soul is fully present everywhere. It's not saying, oh, okay, the soul is in the foot or the soul is in the ear. That's why if I lose one part of my body, I don't lose part of my soul. If my soul were located in my foot and I lose my foot, then I lose my soul. If my soul is located in, my entire part of my body, if I lose, part of my body, then it's also, remember, we don't say, okay, now you only have a percentage of your soul. So it's kind of this omnipresent, not located in one aspect. So this also helps us to understand how God is fully present everywhere. So God occupies space in the same way that our soul occupies the body. So the way you can kind of think about it is that Our soul occupies our body. God occupies all of space. So our soul is kind of limited to, our physical body. We can leave that body for a short amount of time, but it's not like when our soul leaves our body, if you're thinking of outer body experiences, it's still kind of confined in a physical space. It's not, like in all the examples that you may read about, it's not like it's spread out and it's aware of all things. It's seeing still things limited to where it's located, and kind of floating around. So it's still kind of limited in a physical space. So it still has a limitation, but God is fully present everywhere. So his kind of space that's limited is all space. So he isn't really limited at all by a spatial kind of volume. So this should kind of make sense because Christianity states that mankind is made in the image of God. So we should see some parallel between how we are in our soul and God. So, but it's not going to be exactly the same because we aren't God. We're made in his image, but we are not God. So that's why we have more limitations when it comes to our soul and where we're located, even though it is kind of everywhere in our body, whereas God is present everywhere in space. So I hope that kind of helps a little bit to kind of think through that relationship. So in closing, at the beginning of this, I said a quote by Rene Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But as we've looked at this study, it says that I am more than just the sum total of a physical brain and body parts. Rather, I am a soul and I have a body. I think, therefore I am. Or as Hackett said, with modest apology to Descartes, he would say, cogito ergo tuus est. I think, therefore God is. And so his argument was because we think and because we have a mind, then that is evidence that there is a God. So thank you so much for coming to my talk today. Here are just a few of the references that I mentioned, including the Penfield studies and references for some of the quotes that I had. And I look forward to having you in my join in my next talk.